Good morning, everybody, or I should say, depending on where you're joining us from, a good afternoon or a good evening, I guess, to some of you. But to all of you, welcome back to day 2 of this year's America's Spectrum Management Conference. So we're delighted to have you all back here with us again for today's sessions. We had a really interesting day yesterday, a packed day yesterday, but some really interesting discussions. And a reminder that for those of you who might be joining us today for the first time, or for anyone who missed any of the sessions yesterday, all of the sessions that took place yesterday are available now to download. There's a link in the reception area if you wanted to watch any of those back. And you should also have received an email with details for how to download those. I think actually came through overnight US time, so you should have received that as well. So all of those are there to watch again. And today we're looking forward to another full day, another day, I'm sure, of what's going to be some really interesting discussions around some of the key topics related to spectrum policy across the US, Canada, and the wider Americas as well. So yesterday we kind of focused more generally on a number of the key issues, looking at spectrum sharing, looking at kind of digital divide and providing universal access. Today we're moving on, and we're going to be looking more specifically at a number of the key bands. And the first 4 sessions we have today are actually going to be focusing on different mid-band frequencies, and looking forward to kind of diving down into a bit more depth on those kind of issues there. Before we get started though, just a couple of things I did want to mention. First of all, I wanted to once again say a big thank you to all of our sponsor and partner organizations who've been involved in the event. So you can see the logos for all of the different organizations who have supported the event on the screen in front of you now. Thank you to each and every one of them. We really do appreciate the support. Without them, the event wouldn't be possible. So thank you to all of our sponsors and all of our partner organizations. Next up, maybe just to go into a bit more detail on what we're going to be covering today. So as I mentioned, we're going to be starting off by focusing on some of the key mid-band frequencies. In a second, we're going to be looking at the C-band with our first session, looking at what next for the C-band in Canada and the US. After our break, I should say, we're then going to be moving on to look at the 6 gigahertz band and the CBRS band. And then this afternoon, moving on to look at the 12 gigahertz band. Before we go up in the frequencies a little bit, focus on the millimeter wave bands. And then finally, we finish by looking maybe beyond 5G. So for those of you who joined us for Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel's keynote speech yesterday, she started to mention the journey towards 6G. So we're delighted to have a session that's going to be looking a little bit at that and looking beyond 5G. And finally, a reminder that as well as all the sessions that are taking place here on the main stage, on the plenary stage, we do have our on-demand sessions taking place as well. So we're delighted to have 7 different on-demand sessions, which you can find by navigating using the menu bar on the left-hand side of your screen to the on-demand and expo area. These sessions are really going into a bit more depth on some of the key issues that we are focusing on here on the main stage. And I do urge you to go and check those out. There's some really interesting discussions, and it's a chance, as I said, to go into more specific detail on some of these key issues. So you can see there the 7 sessions that we have available. They will be available for the duration of today, and they're also available on YouTube. So even after the event, if you wanted to go back and check those out, we'll be sending links around to those as well. So please do make sure to check out the on-demand area, as well as, of course, following the sessions happening here on the main stage. So that's what we've got going on today. So another busy day, and I guess we better get started. So it's now my pleasure to welcome to the stage our moderator for this first session. So that's Amit Nagpal from Ether Consulting. Amit, welcome. Great to have you with us again. And yeah, really looking forward to the discussion here. Obviously, the C-band is a key topic. It has been a key topic all around the world for quite some time. But obviously, in the US and Canada, it's quite a specific approach and things that have been taken. So looking forward to hearing an update on that and generally looking at the key issues on that. So without further ado, I will pass over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. And I have to say it's a great pleasure to participate again in this conference. So, it's amazing that we're up to the 10th conference already, and I look forward to the next 10 or 20. I suppose it's just a bit of a shame that we're not all there in person, but hopefully next year we'll be well along the recovery path from this COVID thing, and we will be able to actually all meet in person and have the sort of conference that we would all really like. So yeah, Dan, as you said, this is the first of 4 sessions today looking at the mid-band spectrum, and it's a good opportunity really today to sort of do a deeper dive into the spectrum bands that have sort of already partially come up in discussion, I would say, in day one, and just get into a little bit more detail on them. So as you said, with this is talking about the C-band in Canada and the US. I suppose just before going into the sort of session, I suppose I wanted to sort of say a little bit more about what we mean by C-band, because sometimes C-band is used to refer to a very wide frequency range, and sometimes it's used to, particularly I think in the context of auction 107, it was very, very specifically related to the spectrum in that band. So I think really what we want to do in this session is really focus on the wider 3.5 gigahertz range. So, all the way down to, we're talking about sort of down to 3.1 possibly in North America, all the way up to something like 4.2 gigahertz. And, the reason for doing this is that this sort of frequency range is very much seen as the sort of key 5G band in many of the countries around the world. And obviously in this session, we're sort of starting with a focus on sort of the US and Canada, but I'm sure as the discussions take place, we'll kind of widen out and start to talk about some of the sort of frequencies that are used in other areas of the world, as we did yesterday, in fact. But sort of as a starting point, looking in the US, we've obviously had the CBRS and what was called the C-band auctions 105 and 107 in the last couple of years, and I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit about those. I mean, one thing I would say though is obviously there is a session on CBRS coming up, so probably what I would suggest to the audience is leave any questions on CBRS for that later session, unless it's something that you think one of our speakers in this session is particularly well placed to address. So I guess probably we'll be sort of more focusing on sort of what happened in the C-band auction and how the spectrum is being used. Now, obviously, we're in the quiet period for the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz auction. So just to warn the audience, I'm afraid our speakers can't really say much about this because of this quiet period. But what everybody can talk about is other future mid-band awards. So, I think yesterday we talked a little bit about the range from 3.1 to 3.45. So that's certainly a topic for discussion in the panel, and welcome any questions on that. And over to Canada. So thinking about Canada, we had the sort of 3.5 gigahertz award earlier this year, and we'll have a presentation on that. And obviously we have sort of the equivalent of the US C-band spectrum, sort of 3.7 and above. And Canada is looking at how it can make that available. So again, I'm sure we'll hear about that and welcome any questions from the audience on that. So we have an absolutely fabulous panel. We've got 6 speakers. Sort of a mix of regulators and industry representatives, and obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the session is entitled "The Canada and the US," but I'm sure some of the speakers will talk about some of the worldwide trends as well. And as usual, we invite the speakers to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes each, and then once we get through that, we'll have an open discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, we're very open to receiving questions for the audience on that, and I'll look to bring as many of those in as we can in the time available. So we're going to get going. Time is running, so let's go straight on to our first speaker. And I'm very pleased to introduce Matthew Pearl, who is the Associate Bureau Chief for the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau in the FCC. And it'll be great to start with the sort of regulator's perspective on mid-band spectrum and C-band in the US. So over to you, Matthew. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm going to provide some background on the proceeding first. I didn't want to assume that folks have a deep background in this band. So I apologize if folks are already aware of it, but I'll try to do that pretty quickly. And then to provide an update on where we are in the transition in the US. So we're talking about the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band. This has been the workhorse band for downlink satellite in the US. It's been paired with the 6 gigahertz band, which is used for uplink. And it's been the workhorse, especially for the distribution of video and audio content from programmers to both broadcasters and cable systems. And in the US, it's obviously very critical. There are over 100 million Americans that receive television service via providers that use C-band as part of their delivery system. And there are 5 satellite operators that have space stations that, according to the record that we had in the proceeding, were transmitting using C-band signals to the incumbent Earth stations. Initially we had approximately 20,000 incumbent Earth stations that were receiving these signals. Again, primarily broadcasters and cable systems. So obviously, in the US, we recognized that the satellite use of the spectrum was very important. And we had to protect and preserve that. But at the same time, starting in 2017, we started looking at whether it might be possible to repurpose some of the band for flexible use, including 5G uses. So that proceeding, continued. We received a record, and ultimately in 2020. The commission adopted a report and order that provided for the repurposing of the lower 300 megahertz of the band. And that opened up 280 megahertz for flexible use at 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. And then there was a 20 megahertz guard band between the lower part of the band for flexible use and satellite, which would continue to be able to use the upper 200 megahertz on a permanent basis. So in the report and order, the way that the commission effectuated the transition was that it modified the licenses of the satellite operators, and it required those operators to transition out of the lower 300 megahertz by December 5th, 2025. But there was also a desire to be able to make the spectrum available for 5G on a faster schedule than that. So it also provided the satellite operators with the opportunity to receive accelerated relocation payments if they both elected to transition out of the bottom part of the band on a faster timeline, and they actually completed that transition on the accelerated timeline. And specifically, in order to receive those payments, they need to transition out of the bottom 120 megahertz in 46 out of the top 50 markets by December of this year. So that's what we call the phase 1 accelerated relocation. And they also would need to transition out of the full lower 300 megahertz across the contiguous United States by December 5th, 2023. So that's the phase 2 accelerated relocation. The commission also adopted licensing and technical rules to provide for new wireless services in the part of the band, including, as I mentioned, flexible use rules. And in a separate PN, the commission adopted procedures to auction the lower portion of the band. The commission also delegated authority to the Wireless Bureau and the Office of Managing Director to conduct oversight of the transition. And it provided for 2 other entities, a clearinghouse which handles the cost-related aspects of the transition. That was selected by an outside committee of stakeholders. Also, the clearinghouse resolved some disputes in the first instance. And it also provided for a relocation coordinator, which was selected by the satellite operators to coordinate the transition process across the different operators. So the auction was held in late 2020, early 2021, and it generated over $80 billion in bids. And it's important to note that that $80 billion did not include the relocation payments to reimburse incumbents for the transition, and it also didn't include the accelerated relocation payments. Both of those other type of payments go directly from the overlay licensees to the clearinghouse, and then to the incumbents that receive them. So that kind of brings us to where we are now in the transition. The Wireless Bureau has granted 5,676 overlay licenses. So the vast bulk of the licenses have now been granted. We've undertaken a number of actions recently to advance and oversee the transition. That includes updating the list of incumbent Earth stations so that everyone understands who needs to be transitioned and protected and receive service on a continuous and uninterrupted basis. We've also opened windows for the satellite operators to amend their transition plans, and we've reviewed those updated transition plans. We've adopted phase 1 certification procedures for the satellite operators to certify that they have completed the phase 1 relocation, and then for us to evaluate and make a determination about that. And we've also adopted incremental reduction procedures if any of the satellite operators were to miss the phase 1 deadline on December 5th, but within a certain period of time complete the accelerated relocation. Those would be procedures for figuring out sort of what the reduction in the accelerated relocation payment is. And so the satellite operators have been doing the work to transition out of the lower 120 megahertz. Again, in phase 1, that's in 46 out of the top 50 PEAs. The Wireless Bureau has been overseeing that. Now that we're approaching the phase 1 deadline, 4 out of the 5 satellite operators have submitted certifications of accelerated relocation for phase 1. And so they've certified that they have completed all the actions that were required to transition by December 5th. And so the Wireless Bureau and other bureaus and offices at the Commission are in the process of reviewing those certifications and also seeing if there are any challenges from other parties to those certifications. Even as we're reviewing those certifications, we're also preparing for the phase 2 transition. Again, that would be across the contiguous United States in 300 megahertz. And so we're preparing for that to make sure that that is also a success. So happy to take questions, but that's sort of the basic background on the proceeding and where things stand right now.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Matt. I think that was a great overview of, the whole process, and also, as you said, it's good overview of, exactly where we are today. So thank you very much for that. Okay, let's move on to our next speaker, and can I introduce Rachel Bender, who is the Vice President and Associate General Counsel with Verizon. And essentially, Verizon, as you'll probably hear, was the biggest winner of the C-band spectrum. So we're very interested to hear how Verizon plans to use the spectrum and how you're getting on in terms of planning for the use of the spectrum. So over to you, Rachel.
Great, thanks, Amit, and thanks so much for having me back again this year. Matt did a great job of going over the proceedings, so I'll try not to repeat too much of what he said, but he just condensed several years of work into just a few minutes summary. So I want to acknowledge the FCC staff first, who worked so hard on this proceeding. It is so unique in many aspects, and the work will really continue throughout the transition for the next couple of years, as Matt just alluded to. So for Verizon, yes, we have a huge interest in the success of the C-band transition. As Amit just said, we were a big winner in the C-band auction. We won between 140 and 200 megahertz in all license areas across the contiguous United States. And as part of that, we won 60 megahertz of spectrum that is being cleared in phase 1, which covers 46 of the top markets in the country and is home to more than half of the US population, giving us early access to this cleared spectrum very soon. Our C-band assets represent a 120% increase in our sub-6 gigahertz spectrum holdings. So it's a big deal for the company, and we think it will help us accelerate our 5G deployment. Putting that into dollars, Verizon will spend upwards of $53 billion when you add up the $45 billion plus that we spent on the licenses we won in the auction, with our portion of the accelerated relocation payments and the transition reimbursements. And that does not include all that we're spending to build out C-band services. So we made an additional $10 billion commitment for our C-band deployment over the next few years. We're going to put this spectrum into use as quickly as possible. We are working on getting 6,000 to 8,000 sites ready just in the next few months as phase 1 wraps up. And we're getting ready to roll out C-band across the country in the next few years. So all of that investment means we are very interested in what's happening with the transition. We are following what's happening now with the certificates of accelerated relocation that, as Matt mentioned, were filed by 4 of the 5 space station operators, saying that their phase 1 transitions are complete. And we are looking forward to the official culmination of phase 1 very soon, hopefully. So, even though the auction is over and the wireless licenses have been granted and now phase 1 is winding down, there's still a lot of work to be done on all sides. The space station operators need to launch new satellites next year and continue transitioning services. The Earth station operators have to install final filters to complete their phase 2 transition across all PEAs. And remember, Verizon is also on this side of the transition. We are an incumbent Earth station operator utilizing C-band, and we worked with our satellite service providers over the last several months to transition our Earth stations in phase 1 areas. So we really understand firsthand the incredible amount of work going on to make sure all Earth stations remain whole throughout this process. Meanwhile, the clearinghouse will continue to process reimbursement expenses, and the relocation coordinator will continue to work with all of the space station operators to ensure a timely and smooth transition. And for our part on the wireless side, since we have phase 1 licenses, Verizon will be working hard to deploy in those areas, and will also be preparing for C-band in the rest of the country when that spectrum is cleared. I think all this comes back to Matt, though. All of these stakeholders are going to continue to rely on the FCC to partner with us as the transition moves forward. There really are so many unique parts of this transition, and we'll continue to work with the FCC as we encounter them and get over these hurdles to make sure the C-band transition happens smoothly and on time. So all of this is happening over the next couple of years. Meanwhile, 5G is going to continue to grow across the United States. We will continue to build out the network at Verizon. More handsets and devices are going to roll out that are C-band compatible. And hopefully at the end of the day, the C-band transition will be a big success story. So, bottom line, Verizon, we are excited about C-band. We look forward to deploying our C-band spectrum and plan to expand 5G services across the country. So I think, I'll stop there. I want to thank Forum Global again for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for that overview of how important the spectrum is to Verizon and how you're planning to use it. So much appreciated. Okay, we're going to switch now from the US over to Canada, and I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Chantal Davis, who is Senior Director, Regulatory Policy with ICED in Canada. And I guess you're going to talk about the 3.5 gigahertz auction that has taken place, and also look forward to Canada's own C-band award process. Over to you. Thank you.
So thank you to the organizers for inviting me back again. It's been a very busy year in Canada with respect to C-band. So I'll dive right in because I've got quite a few slides. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So just a little bit about our recent 3500 auction. So it started in June and it went a little over a month. So for those of you who might not be familiar, we actually had a significant amount of spectrum that was going over to continue to be in the hands of some of the existing licensees. So the auction, we had between 30 and 140 megahertz of spectrum available across 142 areas in the country. But this auction was kind of different in the sense that we did assign the whole band through the auction process. So everybody had to move, and so we actually assigned 3,400 licenses through the auction. However, we had around 1,504 licenses available. It was a very successful auction. All but 9 licenses were sold. And those 9 that weren't sold were in more northern and less populated areas. In addition, we did manage to get 757 licenses into the hands of some of the smaller regional operators. So again, from a competition perspective, this was very important for Canada. It is the largest auction revenue that we've seen to date. So it was a total revenue of $8.91 billion. And so next stage for the 3,500 megahertz band will be the transition. We have a 3-phase transition with cities going earlier in the next 6 months, and then going all the way to 3 years for some of the more rural areas. So, hopefully this will be one of our key 5G bands going forward. So next slide, please. So that brings us to the other process that we've been running is the 3,800 megahertz band. We had a consultation in August, and I talked about this last year. So I won't go into the details about the consultation, but I just wanted to keep this in here for people to be able to contrast. So next slide, please. So one of the key decisions as part of a decision that came out in May was that we would repurpose spectrum in this portion of the band. So we are displacing the existing WBS licensees that are in 3650 to 3700. We wanted to ensure as much contiguity between the 2 bands as we possibly could. So that's partially why we're displacing those licensees. We also followed suit with the US and are proposing to move our satellite operations up to 4,000 to 4,200, except for in some remote and northern communities, which I'll talk about shortly. One other thing that was key was we decided there was a proposal from Telesat to be a clearinghouse themselves and to auction the spectrum themselves. We decided not to go that route for multiple reasons. So next slide, please. So we did define what we call satellite dependent areas. So these are shown in red on the slide. Basically, we recognize that we need to continue some rural connectivity. We do have some communities that are reliant on this for connectivity as well as for broadcasting content. So we will allow those to continue to operate in the full 500 megahertz. However, we will make the spectrum available in these areas, but the new licensees will have to protect the existing licensees. We also said that we would have no growth in these areas. So those that receive a license will be protected, but there will be no new licenses below 4,200. Below 4,000. Next slide, please. So one thing that we did change from the consultation is we increased the amount of time for transition. So we included an additional 18 months in our transition plan. So for WBS, it's March 2025 in urban areas and March 2027 in rural areas. One thing we also included was to have a more precise definition between rural and urban. We had proposed to do it on a tier 4 basis, but that left some of the urban areas transitioning later and some of the rural areas transitioning earlier. So we use our tier 5 areas to be a little bit more precise. Again, we will make that spectrum available and new 5G systems can go in. However, they would have to protect WBS until such time. In many cases, WBS is a small corner of a tier, so we do expect that a lot of the spectrum will be usable even before the transition timelines. And we also extended the transition date for the satellites. So again, March 2025, except for in those satellite-dependent areas. And in all cases in Canada, mobile operators who buy the spectrum at auction can come up with deals with existing licensees to transition earlier if they so choose, or to agree to different technical requirements as they so choose. So next slide, please. And so finally, we did decide what we were going to do with the spectrum. So we will auction 250 megahertz of that spectrum, the 3650 to 3900, which is right beside our 3500 that we just auctioned. And we said that this auction will be planned for 2023. So right now we're in the process of developing those auction rules. My team is working on it as we speak. And the other 80 megahertz, we said that we would make it available for shared non-auction spectrum. This is a slightly, we're not sure where this is going to go, in the sense that what type of sharing we're going to use is yet to be determined. So as discussed yesterday, there's multiple different types of sharing and we're looking at all of them. But this will allow that 80 megahertz to be used for the displaced WBS, should they choose to go into that band, and for other 5G use cases. So we're excited about making this available. So again, their next step on this one will be a consultation for a new process. And we're planning to have that open before the WBS transition deadline, the first one. And that's our new development plan. I'll leave it at that. Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you very much, Chantal. And that was a very good overview of everything that's taking place in Canada. Okay, let's go on to our next speaker. Pleased to introduce Jared Carlson, who is Vice President of Government Affairs with Ericsson. And obviously we're going to get the equipment provider's perspective. And I suspect you're going to sort of bring a global perspective on some of the issues as well.
I'll try. Thanks. All right, first off, thank you to Foreign Global, to Dan and Jordan for inviting me. It's an honor to be here on this panel with Matthew, Rachel, Chantal, Alan, and Jerry. And I too would hope that this would be in person, and hope that in 2022 we can do this back in downtown DC. And Amit, thank you so much for agreeing to moderate our panel today. So in terms of the C-band, you can say that at Ericsson and globally, C-band and 5G are synonymous with next-gen connectivity. The estimated population coverage at the end of 2020 for 5G was about 15%. That's the equivalent of over 1 billion people. And the build-out of 5G networks is continuing to accelerate. So to date, there have been more than 160 launches around the world. Commercialization of 5G is moving at such a rapid pace that we forecast that by 2026, 84% of North American mobile subscriptions will be 5G, the highest level of any region in the world. And in large part, that's due to the success of, as Amit laid out, the wider vision of the C-band. Just some proof points. So just 2 days ago, we announced that we inked a 5-year agreement to accelerate the expansion of AT&T's 5G network here in the US. That'll help support their deployment of C-band spectrum and the launch of 5G standalone. Deployments like the one we announced on Monday will support future network enhancements like Cloud RAN, which offers providers increased flexibility, faster delivery of services, and greater scalability in networks. Earlier this year, we announced that we will provide T-Mobile with active and passive antennas and support across its entire spectrum portfolio for low band, mid band, and high band, complemented by massive MIMO capacity over mid bands and high bands. And with Rachel here, I would be remiss, in fact, I'd probably get in trouble, if I didn't mention that in July, we announced an $8.3 billion agreement with Verizon to deploy Ericsson's 5G massive MIMO C-band, low band, and millimeter wave solutions to enhance and expand Verizon's 5G ultra-wideband coverage, network performance, and user experience. So despite the uncertainty caused by COVID, service providers continue to switch on 5G. 5G subscriptions with a 5G capable device grew by 70 million during the first quarter of 2021 to reach around 290 million today. And we estimate close to 580 million subscriptions by the end of the year. And what's driving all this use? Excuse me, today in large part it's video, and over time we expect to see more and more use driven by IoT. And in fact, by 2050, we think there'll be at least 24 billion interconnected devices, meaning almost every object around us, from streetlights to thermostats to fitness trackers, even gym vests, will all be connected. 5G deployment will contribute $1.4 to $1.7 trillion to US GDP and create 3.8 to 4.6 million jobs over the next decade. That growth will occur directly through infrastructure investment and indirectly by enabling innovation that transforms all sectors of the economy. And the C-band auction provides evidence of the demand for high power, large license areas, and minimal coordination requirements. It's no surprise, as Matthew said, at its conclusion, the auction reached a record $81 billion, excluding the relocation costs, and became the largest spectrum auction ever held by the FCC. It's a testament to how such an approach is hugely attractive to the industry. And the global majority of countries are harmonizing their use of mid-band spectrum to international standards, such as using 3300 to 4200, that's band N77, and 3300 to 3800 megahertz, that's band 78. And the C-band stretches over both of those ranges. And by harmonizing with international standards, countries will benefit from global economies of scale for both infrastructure and subscriber equipment. So I hope we can all agree C-band is not only crucial for 5G deployment in the US and globally, but it's key to productivity and job growth. And everyone at Ericsson is super excited to see the success of C-band. And Rachel went through some of the issues associated with the transition where we are now. And that's why I want to highlight one issue that I hope we can lay to rest quickly in order to keep deploying solutions in the band. So as it turns out, the area right above the C-band, 4200 to 4400 megahertz, is home to radio altimeters used on aircraft and helicopters worldwide. And recall the C-band use of spectrum, at least in the US, ends at 3.98 gigahertz, providing more than a gaping 200 megahertz of separation between these uses. And when the FCC first saw comment on using some of the C-band spectrum for mobile broadband, it concluded that well-designed aviation equipment should not ordinarily receive any harmful interference. The aviation industry was active in the docket, and the FCC explicitly took their comments into account when making their determinations. But then last October, the Radio Technical Commission for Aeronautics, RTCA, provided the FCC a study that we feel, and the rest of the industry, I think safely, I can speak for them, feels was overly conservative and something of an outlier compared to other aviation studies provided, and also is shrouded in some amount of secrecy. So one big proof point, use of the C-band around the world has not shown any observed effects on altimeters in the presence of significant wireless deployments, which provides further evidence that the study is overly conservative. International 5G deployments in several countries have been operating without interference to altimeters, and the United States military and federal systems have operated near the altimeter band for decades, in fact, with much higher power. In fact, in Japan, mobile use is even closer to aviation use, and there the separation was only 100 megahertz. So based on RTCA's claims, aircraft should have received regular complaints from the use of spectrum below 4,000 megahertz, but that has not been the case. And to be frank, it's somewhat telling, I think, that the aviation community has shrouded their testing in some secrecy, not providing the models of the altimeters on the technical specifications for them that we're using in their studies. So Ericsson, for its part, has been very active in the proceeding, and we're very excited about what the C-band has to offer. And hope that with participation and then the support from CTI and 5G Americas in particular, we can resolve the aviation issue and continue the rapid pace of deployment of the C-band. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you again, Jared. I think that was a great overview of sort of use of the C-band, and very interesting highlighting particularly of this altimeter interference issue. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, let's move on to our next speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Alan Ingraham, who is principal with Secretariat Economists. And Alan's going to particularly pick up on one of the issues which I think Chantal alluded to a little bit, which was this issue of spectrum contiguity for operators across these sort of multiple sub-bands within this frequency range and means of ensuring that spectrum contiguity. So over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Amit. Hopping right in, there's a few slides that I've got here. So as Amit mentioned, what I wanted to talk about today is affecting contiguity between two bands that are auctioned separately and sequentially. So there was an initial auction, and Canada serves as a great example of this. So there was an initial 3,500 megahertz auction this summer. There's a plan for the future, the 3,800 megahertz C-band auction. If you've got participants in both auctions and they're interested in contiguous holdings between those two bands, what are some of the mechanisms that you can use to affect this? In addition, there's a particular potential issue in Canada, and that's that because they've already auctioned off the 3,500 megahertz and the equipment ecosystem for that frequency range is more robust if you follow the European banding, so that's band 78, or what's already been deployed in Europe. There's the potential for a winning bidder in 3,500 megahertz to then have spectrum that's aggregated with C-band and to be stuck outside of band 78 and have its equipment for the 3,500 megahertz deployments that it's already incurred effectively be a stranded asset. So that's this one little intricacy that may actually play out in Canada if there is an auction that tries to affect full contiguity of holdings between the two bands. So moving along to the next slide. What are some of the mechanisms we can use? I don't want to spend a lot of time in the first two. What I really want to do is to discuss the third and the fourth mechanism. But just stating them quickly, the first would be to really do nothing, just hold a separate C-band auction, and then try to allow the winning bidders between 3,500 megahertz and C-band to sort it out themselves. This probably would not result in a ton of contiguous holdings between the two bands because of holdout problems. And then you also have to consider the fact that in the 3,500 megahertz auction, you had tier 4 licensing, so 100 odd licenses to cover Canada, smaller geographic areas and more populated population centers. So it might be difficult to affect contiguity then. The second item, a one-sided incentive auction like what the FCC did in auction 103, personally I think this would be overkill. And in addition, it may require statutory authority that ISA doesn't have. So then what are we left with? Well, Rogers and I believe TELUS in some comments to ISA earlier this year had suggested something similar to what was done by the FCC in auction 107, where there was an auction for the A block and frequency assignments for the A block, and in the allocation phase, BC was a separate product category, and in the assignment phase, there were these initial A block assignments and then final ABC block assignments. So you were able to get frequency reassignment of your quote-unquote A block holdings into just the totality of the band A, B, and C blocks. That is one possible solution. The issue with it is this potential stranded cost if band 78 equipment is deployed initially, or if band 77 equipment can't be easily retuned over the totality of band 77 holdings. So how do we deal with that if it is an issue? And I want to try to put forward an alternative mechanism that would allow bidders to indicate to the marketplace and to ISID what are some of the exchange fees that they might need to be relocated out of band 78. So moving along, we can compare and contrast these two. Next slide, please. So first, what are the commonalities between these two mechanisms? The first thing that we're going to do is give winning bidders in 3,500 megahertz the option of opting out of reassignment. If they opt out, we're going to repack them to the bottom of 3,500 megahertz, and we'll do that because regardless if you're within the bottom of the band, reassignment within that 3,500 megahertz should be easily done simply with a software patch and retuning of your equipment. You don't have to install new radios. You don't have to go to your cell sites. That's my understanding anyway. And Jared can certainly correct me if I'm wrong on this. The next thing we're going to do is run an allocation phase for the C-band auction. Then, and as Chantal mentioned, WBS is going to be relocated to the top of the C-band. Then you can guarantee full contiguity after you generate all the allowable assignments, as you would in any standard assignment round of an auction with generic licensing in the allocation phase. Were it the case that WBS is not relocated, I do want to discuss this just in general. You can still improve on contiguity, but there's the chance that you could get at least one split assignment in geographies. So if your goal is full contiguity, it is a good thing to relocate WBS to the top of the band. Now we get into the different mechanisms. So under the no exchange discount mechanism, you're just conducting a very standard assignment round. It's just you're doing it with the totality of the frequency holdings that are among non-opt-out bidders in 3500 and any additional frequencies that they won in the C-band auction. So it's the standard WDP. All of your bids must be greater than or equal to 0 for all of your potential frequency assignments. WDB, the winner determination program, determines your optimal frequency assignments in any geography or set of geographies. And then your Vickery-Clark-Groves core consistent pricing rule determines the prices that would be paid by any bidder in the assignment rounds. In the exchange discount case, we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to have a first price rule, and we're going to allow bidders to submit, I'm going to call them negative bids. And so if we move on to the final slide, you can see the example of those negative bids. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is to divide these bids into separate groups. So for this bidder, they've won spectrum in both 3500 megahertz and in 3800 megahertz. The band is a little bit off because I wanted to fit this into one slide. It goes up to 3910, whereas it's only going to go up to 3900 in actuality. But this bidder is given all their possible frequency assignments of all 100 megahertz. And if you'll notice, for the top two assignments, they're moved completely out of band 78. So for these assignments, they're going to be allowed to submit negative bids, and these are the largest, the most negative bids, the biggest discount on spectrum fees that they can ask for in this particular assignment round. This particular bidder has submitted negative bids of $3,000 for both of them. For group 2, the bidder is moved out of band 78, but not entirely. So here they can also submit negative bids, but they can't be more negative than the bids in group 1. In group 3, they're now no longer outside of group 78, so they've got holdings entirely within group 78. So here they're forced to provide at least as much money back to the system as they were asking for in exchange for being moved entirely out of band 78. So this allows a bidder in this auction to ask for discounts if they're moved out of band 78, but provide money to the system in exchange for staying within band 78. Now, if we then run this auction with other bidders, what you'll find is that bidders that are moved entirely out of band 78 can potentially receive discounts on their spectrum fees in any given locality, only in the event that there's enough money from the totality of bidders in that geographic region to compensate them for moving. So the assignment rounds raise net positive revenues. Some bidders may get discounts on their allocation phase monies, but it's not a pure incentive auction. And so I know that this is a lot for 7 minutes, but hopefully it'll spur some thoughts into some of these different mechanisms. And at bare minimum, it gets you thinking about some of the ways that we could affect contiguity in these types of auctions. Thank you.
Alan, for sort of giving us this overview of some thoughts on potential solutions. And as you say, a lot for people to think about. But I think you very clearly explained the problem, and as well as a sort of potential way of getting around it in Canada at least. Okay, let's move on to our next speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Jerry Oberst, who is Senior Counsel with Hogan Lovells. And those of you that are at the conference or joined the conference yesterday will very much know that he's very much an expert in the satellite industry. He'd been advisor to the industry for many years, and in the industry as well, particularly recently. And I guess, Jerry, you'll be able to sort of give us some thoughts, although you're not representing any individual company within the industry. I guess you'll be able to give us some general thoughts on how the satellite industry is doing in terms of obviously the big transition it's facing to make this C-band spectrum available for mobile use. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Amit. I really appreciate this opportunity to focus on the C-band experience, because before I rejoined the Hogan Lovells law firm, I was deeply involved in the very beginning of the U.S. experience as part of the regulatory team for the C-band Alliance, the CBA. We were involved in lobbying and commenting to the FCC and working out the details from the satellite perspective. The CBA, to achieve the transition on our side, had to put a tiger team in place with representatives of the major satellite companies working intensively in a special office just for that purpose. There was a lot of work and a lot of the FCC filings. The FCC database lists 105 filings from the CBA in the proceeding up to early February last year. Now, and Amit, you're right. I'm speaking on a purely personal basis right now, not representing any particular party. But what I do want to focus on is the enormous effort the satellite companies had to undertake to get to where we are today. And I think this is a lesson for any transition of the substantial amount of spectrum that's being used for a substantial amount of service. Now, Matt called the C-band this morning the workhorse of the video field, and it was. The entire video ecosystem was based for years on delivery of programming via C-band capacity, on satellites reusing the spectrum at every 2 degrees in the orbital arc, delivering to 20,000 Earth stations, serving 100 million customers who depended on it for video programming. So this was not an insubstantial matter. And to transition away from this took some very big steps from the satellite sector and others. So let me talk about those steps. First, the satellite companies themselves had to overcome a strong tradition of using the spectrum. I mean, we defended the use of the C-band for decades at the national, regional, and ITU levels. It was a hard decision to take, not to fight or stretch out the proceeding. And this is always going to be an issue for spectrum users with an installed base with substantial investments and historic operations. Second step, the companies had to agree to work together. The spectrum was non-exclusive, so one holdout could mess up the entire works. That required a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiation and agreements before the satellite companies even could approach the FCC, and the result was the creation of the C-band Alliance, the CBA. Third, technical standards had to be defined on the satellite side. Now, most important was how much spectrum to put on the table. Too much, and you couldn't continue to serve the video market. Too little, and the long knives would come out asking for more. In fact, the CBA did start out with one offer, which the process ultimately pushed higher. But other technical features that were a part of this step were to continue to serve the video ecosystem with a smaller amount of spectrum. How to do it? Well, additional satellites, which are not cheap or quick to make, would be ordered. Calculations on how to move clients around to get more efficient, repacked use of the transponders was figured out. Filters to be installed in every receive antenna in the country had to be developed from scratch, and then plans how to get them in place. Major gateway stations had to be relocated and consolidated, and even compression technology had to be worked out for some customers. I'm not sure that anyone who was not directly involved in the process can imagine the work that was involved. Fourth step, other policy issues had to be resolved through the FCC process. Now, the satellite companies thought that they should get the money from auctioning the spectrum to highest value users in the mobile terrestrial area in the shortest possible time. Well, the FCC thought otherwise and set aside what it thought was a reasonable amount to cover the high expenses that the companies would incur to come out of from the mobile terrestrial operators who ultimately won the spectrum, plus essentially an accelerated relocation payment to get fast action. That fast action was really important. Every policymaker from the president on down was saying that 5G was extremely important to the country and the economy. Economists figured out very high costs to the economy of delay. Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel this morning, or yesterday that is, described 5G as an essential part of interlocking applications. So it was really important to get this transition off the ground. And the satellite companies emphasized it really couldn't happen fast without their cooperation and working together. Now, of course, there was opposition on policy issues. Some folks wanted all the spectrum, no matter what that did to the video ecosystem. My view is the satellite companies have retained the bare minimum to serve that media sector. Some satellite companies with market access to the US, but not a dime of service revenues based on using C-band, wanted a piece of the pie, which made life a little difficult for the satellite companies who started the process and actually were serving the US. The broadcasters, of course, were concerned about their ability to continue receiving programming, and the terrestrial mobile folks wanted to make sure the technical features made the spectrum clean for their purposes. Now, Matt and Rachel were very much involved with this, and wasn't that docket a lot of fun? Whew. Now, where are we today? The last big step is to actually carry out the transition. Matt described the overall transition and the two phases that are involved. And I can't speak about any current controversies or pleadings, but I am told that at least 4 of the 5 satellite companies have completed their phase 1 obligations and filed their certifications in just the last few days. One of my former colleagues in the middle of that work said words cannot even describe how much effort went in to getting that first phase transition squared away. New satellites are being constructed. Those satellites should either be in space or on the launch pad around this time next year. Phase 2 filters are already being installed. You can read about the transition and what's going on in the filings that companies made on the FCC record. So these are basically lessons that transitions are not easy. They take time, they take huge efforts, and timing is important. You have to give the incumbent users time to make other arrangements. And if you incentivize the process, it can happen relatively quickly, or at least much more quickly than a process full of challenges, court suits, and inertia. Transitions require a collaborative framework that incentivizes all stakeholders to participate in a final outcome. And I think this is something that other admins can learn from. So in sum, it was an amazing, unique, exciting period, which is not over, but I was very glad to be a part of this transition. And I do think it can be a lesson around the world for how to move faster towards a 5G. And I really do, again, thank Forum Global and all the organizers for allowing me the opportunity to speak a little bit about what the satellite industry put into this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you for that overview of, as you say, of all the exactly what was involved in that process and what is still involved, as what is still to be done as well. But also, I like the way you sort of generalized it to be sort of lessons that can be sort of taken into account for any complex reallocation process. I think that's very helpful. Okay, so we now move on to sort of the open panel discussion, and I'd remind the audience, if you have any particular questions you want to raise, please do so. I can see some starting to come through to us from Dan now. Just before we go to the audience questions, maybe I could pose one of my own. I was sort of reflecting on both your presentation, Jerry, and also Matthew's presentation. And you both sort of alluded to the fact, I think also Rachel also mentioned this, about 4 of the 5 satellite providers have sort of indicated they've completed their obligations. And it made me sit here wondering, are you kind of indirectly highlighting that one is in trouble and you're not going to make the deadline? And if that is even a possibility, I suppose what I don't understand is, what does that actually mean? Does it mean the whole thing is going to be delayed because, it's sort of knock-on effects, if you like? Or does it mean, what does it actually mean? Does it mean part of the spectrum is released, or polyspectrum in some areas is released, because some Earth stations haven't moved over, or whatever. Maybe I don't know if anyone can speak to that.
So the satellite operators have in the U.S. have until December 5th to file their certifications. And based on the information we have thus far, we don't have any reason to believe that any of them would miss that deadline. As I mentioned, they've been required to submit transition plans and provide updates to those plans, and we've carefully reviewed them. So obviously, as Jerry made clear, the satellite operators are doing all the work, but we've been following it and overseeing it. And so we don't have any reason to believe that there would be an operator that didn't complete it by December 5th. But again, I can't sort of prejudice. We do need to review the certifications. There's a lot of information in there,
Yes.
and we need to cross-check that against other data sources and information. Again, this is all just directed at making sure that both the Earth station operators receive continuous and uninterrupted service, and also that obviously the consumers that are relying on the spectrum also do. So that's the purpose of reviewing it so carefully, but don't have any reason to believe that there's going to be a problem at this point.
It's very helpful, thank you. Anybody else like to comment, or? I think Matthew's answer was very clear otherwise.
Well, Emmett, I would comment that the major satellite companies have made their certifications, and I also would not expect there to be any such problem.
Okay, great. I think that's very reassuring, probably for Rachel in particular. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to bring in one of the audience questions, and let's see if you can answer this. So, questions at ISED and the FCC. In both the US and Canada, the issue of interference between altimeters and C-band has been brought to the fore after an auction. In Canada, exclusion and protection zones in dense urban areas were just announced. How will this issue be solved? Filters for the altimeters. Joanne LeMay, this question is from Joanne LeMay from LeMay Yates Associates. I know this issue is under study, so I don't know to the extent anybody can actually give the answer at this stage, but if there is anything anybody can say, what's the issues under study, that would be great. Jerry, did you want
Emmett, I'm not commenting at all on the current controversy or the studies or the ultimate outcome, but again, this points out to how an intensive effort has to be made at the very beginning to identify all of these issues, because the CBA did speak with representatives of this sector very early on in the process. So, and you have to do that because lots of issues are involved with the transition. So it again is a pointer for what has to be done for any kind of substantial transition.
Okay. Yep, indeed. Can anyone else speak to this? I mean, I appreciate the answer, the straightforward answer is studies are underway. So, but if there is anything anyone else can say beyond that, that would be great. Chantal, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. So at the end of the day, we are studying it. We did signal before the auction that this might be coming. It did come up really much towards the end, and nobody expected it to be a problem so far on frequency. But I know Jared mentioned that there are other systems that are in play, and so there have been no interference. However, in Canada, 3500 will be a high power band, so we do need to take the safety of Canadians into account. We don't want anything to happen on that score. So yeah, we are working with our transport sector as well as with the operators to figure out what the best approach is, and that those consultations are underway at the moment.
Thank you. Jared, did you want to say something? I wasn't sure if you were.
No, just agreeing that more coordination, the better.
Okay, very good, very good. Okay, I'll bring in another question from the audience. I'm not sure who this is from, but I've certainly got the question. So the question is, may there be scope to free up more spectrum in the C-band for 5G sometime in the future? Is there a chance that some satellite companies may be open to this in return for additional compensation payments? Jerry, I know I'm putting you on a little bit on the spot here, but I don't know if you want to comment on this at all.
Everything I've heard from former colleagues is that they now have what they consider the bare minimum to serve 100 million customers in the US. And the fact that they're involved in an incredible effort to get the amount cleared that they have now indicates that I'm not sure how much flexibility there will be anytime in the near future. And the final point, you ask about, could one company give up its frequencies? Well, recall, this is non-exclusive use. So the satellite operators are all using the same spectrum at different locations in the orbital arc. So one company saying, well, I'll give up my spectrum, doesn't really mean anything for clearing it for the use of people in the mobile terrestrial area.
May I sort of follow up that question with a sort of more general question I was going to ask anyway, which was, can you see this sort of model of freeing up sort of part of C-band spectrum being replicated in other parts of the world? I mean, obviously we know that in some parts of the world, C-band is absolutely critical to satellite because of rain fade issues and the likes. But at the same time, 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, as we've heard, is very much the workhorse needed for 5G. So is there any scope in other parts of the world? And I'll throw this one perhaps back to you, Jerry, to start with, maybe Jared and others can do.
At the very beginning, we were concerned that the U.S. process would in some way affect other parts of the world where C-band is even more important because of the rain fade, the conditions that require the use of that mid-band spectrum, and in areas where there's not as large a demand for 5G spectrum. So we did speak, the satellite industry spoke with representatives in other parts of the world to try to indicate that this was uniquely a U.S. experience. The lessons about transitions are general. The conditions are fairly unique here and perhaps in Europe, which had already adopted procedures to allow part of the C-band for use of other services. But in some parts of the world, in Africa and Asia, the Pacific, it would be disastrous for delivery of programming to try the same approach.
Okay. Jared, do you want to come in on?
Yeah, speaking of the model, you know, if you look at what was done in the C-band and what was done in the incentive auction as being examples of, you know, the good that can happen if you get all sides together to figure out, financial solutions, frankly, that work for everybody. I'm actually surprised that we haven't seen more globally. And I don't know, Jerry, if you have more evidence of it, but I would have thought that by now, especially with the success of the 600 megahertz auction and the C-band auction, that you would see more of this model around the world. And hopefully I'm wrong. Maybe there are some more examples, but I'm almost surprised that there aren't more.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll move on to another question unless anybody wants to speak on this particular point. Okay, so we've got to actually, Alan, I think you want to raise a question with Rachel. I mean, rather than me paraphrasing your question, do you want to go back, as you're lucky enough to have the microphone there, do you want to raise your question directly?
Yeah, sure. This was just kind of had been noodling in the back of my head, but in the C-band auction in the United States, in Hawaii and Alaska and the Pacific Islands, there wasn't any spectrum. So therefore, Verizon and any other operator basically has to rely on the CBRS or the GAA spectrum, whereas T-Mobile has 2.6. So does this put Verizon at a disadvantage in those markets relative to T-Mobile? And if so, is there a policy initiative that should be considered?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I don't think it puts us at a disadvantage. You know, our network is being deployed using our full complement of spectrum assets. So we have high band, we have low band, we have mid band. We are all in on millimeter wave. We will use our CBRS spectrum, which we were also, very happy with the auction results there. And we'll continue to use all of our assets to build out 5G in those areas.
Okay, thank you. So just to remind the audience, I think we've got about 10 minutes or so left. So if the audience has any more questions, please do post them up. It's kind of speak now or at least hold your peace for the moment till the next conference session. Maybe I can ask one of my questions in the meantime, and sort of following up a little bit on that. I mean, I was thinking, Alan, about your presentation about the band reconfiguration and thinking about sort of the US band plan as well. And, is there anything we can sort of apply from there? Now, the additional complication we've got with the US band plan is we also have different, if you like, almost sort of, I suppose, rules of use of spectrum. So, for example, the CBRS spectrum has lower power levels. It also has to follow the whole CBRS, process of checking if the spectrum's available, with the SAS and everything. So what I was wondering was, is there any way of getting contiguous blocks there, given this? Even if contiguous blocks aren't possible, the next technical solution is sort of aggregation of individual carriers. But can you actually aggregate a CBRS block, a CBRS channel with a non-CBRS, a sort of normal high power channel, given the power differences and the likes? Or have they got to be separate, totally separate carriers, essentially?
Yeah, Jared might want to speak to this too, but my understanding is that currently the answer is no. You'll need 2 separate radios. Long term, there may be the ability to do that. In my opinion, Verizon certainly believes so. If you look at the way they bid in auction 107, they bid extremely aggressively in the assignment round to win the spectrum that was adjacent to CBRS and C-band. You could say maybe that was avoiding the top of the band because they didn't like it as much. Only Verizon knows. Maybe Rachel can speak to that, but I would interpret that they think that potentially there's the ability to do it long term as the equipment evolves, and they were willing to pay, and they bid the potential to pay a premium for it in the assignment rounds of that auction.
Okay, Rachel, do you want to go first, and then maybe over to Jared afterwards?
Sure. So there's a lot of factors that go into, the assignment round and where we wanted that spectrum. A lot of it, in particular, we wanted phase 1 spectrum so that we could get access to at least part of the C-band as quickly as possible. We want to roll out C-band, now. And so getting that was important to us. And then, having contiguous spectrum just within C-band in the bottom portion of the band was important to us. And so now with phase 1, we'll have access to that 60 megahertz. And then once phase 2 is completed, that will remain our spectrum. We will not have to move after phase 1. We will just expand out in both bandwidth and, geography. And so I think that was really important. We have an average of over 100, I think it's 161 megahertz across all markets if you average out, so just in C-band. And so we feel really good about what we're going to be able to do there.
Thank you. And Jared, I don't know if you can comment on the sort of technical.
Just briefly, though, I'll say as I would never bet against our engineers. I think it is a bit of a challenge, and also remember how dynamic the whole CBRS spectrum is too. But I can tell you that this is, they are hard to work on this.
Yeah, just to pick up on Jared's point, I do think it's important to note. I won't sort of comment on the technologies. Obviously, some other folks on the panel know that better. But one of the interesting things about CBRS is that it creates the potential for contiguity on a dynamic basis, as opposed to sort of the static basis we've used before. So, when you're talking about a band that the military uses, you have other incumbent uses. And so it would be impractical to in a static way, provide for contiguity. But these sharing technologies and cognitive radio and a lot of these developments create the possibility to do it when it's if and when it's available, which can be very helpful to industry.
Okay. And just one sort of final question on the sort of the reconfiguration topic. Chantal, in terms of sort of some of the things that Alan has raised as some of the possibilities, are those the sort of things that ICET is thinking about at the moment?
Well, I really can't say too much, but we have gotten quite a few comments of different ideas, and so we are looking at those. It is difficult, though, so even though there's not a difference in power level, there is quite a bit of time difference between the two bands, plus the different types of encumbrances, as well as difference in when those encumbrances move out. So it isn't... it's never as simple as we would like it to be. It will, but it is a subject that we very much expect to be part of the next consultation.
The world is never simple, is it? I always love the sort of presentation that all you have to do is this and this. But if everything was okay, but of course the real world is full of lots of historical anomalies and the like. So yeah, we would certainly never design things today if we had a clean sheet of paper. But yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, maybe I can ask a question actually looking forward in time, which is, obviously a lot of mid-band spectrum is being cleared up, has been cleared up, or is in the process of being cleared up and made available, and there's future plans for the awards. We've got the auctions ongoing in the US at the moment and looking at below 3.1. Canada's looking at C-band being made available. My question really is this now enough for the next sort of 10, 15 years for the mobile industry? Or it relates a little bit back to the question I think it was this third question we started out with about, can the satellite operators release more? Or have we got enough now to keep us going for 10, 15 years so we can at least park the arguments on this particular area of spectrum for a while and focus on some of the other areas? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think I can take the first shot at this one. We're certainly at the FCC not resting on our laurels. We do recognize that making additional spectrum available, and particularly mid-band spectrum, is going to be critical to 5G and other advanced services. As you noted, we need to avoid any discussion of 3450 to 3550. But we are looking for other opportunities. I think just as one example, we've been working with our federal partners in the U.S. At 3100 to 3450 megahertz as a potential opportunity for non-federal or shared federal non-federal use. And so that's one example. But we do recognize the criticality of mid-band spectrum. And aren't going to, after C-band is made available, not look at other bands. We're already in the process of doing that.
Great, thank you, Matt. Chantal, did you want to?
Yeah. So who knows? It's always and anybody would say they want more spectrum, but we are seeing an uptick in demand for the private networks. So that is something that we talked about that yesterday. We do expect to continue to have some demand there. So we will be looking at some more opportunities there potentially. Again, we'll be following what's going on internationally and see where things fall. We do have the same issues as the US in the below 3450 band. We have the exact same use, so it would be something that we'd be following closely.
Jared, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, actually, Matthew said it best. And in fact, the FCC actually is proceeding on IoT and specifically. And as I mentioned, we do see a lot of demand coming from that area. And so, in terms of specifics, absolutely excited about the possibility for repurposing some or all of 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz spectrum for licensed use. You've got the entire chunk of 6 gigahertz spectrum for unlicensed right now. So if you look at what's out there, we're in fairly good shape, but we're always looking to the future. And we, internally, we sort of, transmit to people that it takes about 10 years from when you look at a band to when you can actually start to put it to commercial use. And so, I hope it won't be that long. I know people have been talking about it a little bit, and we would like to actually see some exploration around the band that goes beyond 6 gigahertz, 7.125 up to 8.5 gigahertz as another, future spectrum. What'll be, it's interesting how mid-band kind of changes definition, but future mid-band spectrum.
Amit, yesterday in the satellites session, Carl Kensiger of the FCC said it's impossible to future-proof licensing systems because there's so much change going on. And I think the same thing is here true, that it's impossible to future-proof the spectrum allocations and the spectrum structure because there's so much change, so many new services, so many new applications. So I can't predict 10 minutes in the future, much less 10 years.
Yeah, just to pick up on Jerry's comment, the situation we're in right now is there is no greenfield spectrum anymore. We've auctioned all of the bands that were used or mostly not used. And so it is going to require both, examining things very carefully in bands that have incumbencies. And then if we repurpose them, coming up with really creative solutions, whether those are market-based or engineering or a combination. But it's always going to be a big challenge, and we just need to be prepared to do it.
It always amazes me, no matter how difficult a problem, whether it be, you can relate it to spectrum or telecoms or even a COVID-19, outbreak. It's amazing how quickly technology responds these days. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And like you say, also there may be market mechanisms coming in the case of spectrum. So yeah, let's see how quickly technology evolves in terms of both the demand on the demand side, resulting in the need for more spectrum, and let's see how technology evolves in taking care of some of that demand by not needing as much spectrum from more spectrally efficient technologies and likes, and mechanisms to actually share spectrum and free or either completely free up spectrum because uses can be compressed. Other users can make use of less spectrum, as we've kind of seen with the satellite opt in C-band so far, or increased sharing mechanisms, as we've talked about, which is probably, as everybody has said, probably realistically the most fruitful direction for going for finding additional spectrum for everybody for new services. Anyway, just to say thank you very much to all of you. I think that was an absolutely fantastic session. Really appreciate your inputs, and also thank you to the audience for your questions. I think we had a good discussion there, and hopefully we've laid the foundations for further discussions on midband. And as we said, I think the midband, we have a session on 12 gigahertz, so midband is rising in frequency by all the time. So, but thank you very much, everybody, and back over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Amit. And again, to echo Amit's thanks to all of our panelists for a really interesting session and a great start to today. So thank you all very much. Really did enjoy that. And Amit, as you said, the focus now is going to continue on midband for the next few sessions as well. But I'm sure C-band in particular is something that we're going to be coming back to in future years, and definitely isn't a discussion that's going to go away. So thank you all very much. Really do appreciate that, and really, really interesting session. Thank you. So yeah, we are, as I said, continuing with a look at other key bands in the mid-band frequencies now. So we actually now have a short break for around about 20 minutes. And then following that, we're back here on the main stage at 10:40. 10:40, that's obviously DC time. And the focus is going to be switching to look at the 6 gigahertz frequencies. So back here for that 6 gigahertz frequency then. So you do have 20 minutes break. Please do remember to check out our on-demand stages. As I said, we have 7 different sessions. I think a couple of the sessions there are actually looking at 6 gigahertz. So please do go and check those out. And as I said, we're then back here on the main stage in 20 minutes for our next session. Thank you very much to Amit. Thank you to all of our panelists in that opening session for a great start to the day. And as I said, look forward to seeing you back here in 20 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, this is Tony DiToro with Link Global. We're inviting you to join our showcase session in the on-demand area. Come find out about our satellite constellation, how we're changing the world of connectivity by connecting everyone directly to the mobile phone already in their pocket. You can hear about our excited mobile operator partners and how they look at Link and our connectivity and built-in resiliency for the future.
Over the last 20 years, Wi-Fi has transformed the world. In Wi-Fi lands, we have worked diligently to ensure that Wi-Fi democratizes connectivity. This vibrant, energetic community of fans that we have, that includes engineers, entrepreneurs, venue owners, operators, policymakers. And with this diversity of community sharing the same interest for Wi-Fi, we can be sure that the next 20 years of Wi-Fi are going to be tremendously exciting.
Hi, my name is Marta Suarez. I am the president of the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, DSA, and I would like to invite you to attend our showcase, about growing global footprint for 6 gigahertz license-exempt access. We are going to have a review about the last updates, and you can participate in the session and watch it on demand and expo area. We will hear about different industry members from the DSA. Will tell us about the global momentum, the ecosystem for 6 gigahertz band and license access, and also some updates about the AFC certification process, the automated frequency coordination. So don't hesitate. I'm sure you will have a lot of interesting information, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Welcome. I'm Peter Linder from Ericsson. I'm heading up 5G marketing here in North America. I have a session for you about 5 different things that have changed or perspective that we all need to know about 5G, perhaps a little bit different from what you normally see. In order to access these ones, I would like to suggest that you head out to view the showcase in the on-demand and expo area. The on-demand and expo area is where you find the showcase. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Jennifer McCarthy, Vice President of Legal Advocacy for Federated Wireless. I'd like to thank the Global Forum team for their efforts in pulling the America Spectrum Conference together, and invite you to come check out the Federated Wireless Showcase at the On Demand and Expo area on the website. We are going to be talking with Kurt Schabach, Federated Wireless's CTO, about the power of cloud computing and how it can be leveraged to improve spectrum management for regulators as well as operators in this era of shared spectrum and new opportunities for 5G deployments. Thank you so much and look forward to seeing you there.
Hello, my name is Ari Fitzgerald. I am the practice leader of the Communications, Internet, and Media practice at Hogan Lovells. We have provided for you a video as part of the showcase that focuses on spectrum policy developments in the US and Latin America. I hope you enjoy the video.